He rejected her in front of 200 witnesses. Her wedding gown was already torn. The iron at her wrists was already cold, but the king's hand was bleeding on the throne, and only she could see why. A wolf kingdom built on a buried law, a council that bottles a king's voice in a silver ring, a cursed crown that burns the lying, and a bloodline they swore they killed 20 winters ago. She does not cry, she does not beg. She lifts her chin and walks the silver line alone. A black chain around his throat, a mark glowing on her palm. 7 dead kings rising from the floor. Don't burn the man, burn the chain. The walls of Valorum had not warmed in 3 weeks. Serafine Ashvale walked between 2 men she had broken bread with in better seasons. The corridor ran east, from the cell block toward the high doors of the Judgment Hall, and every stone in it held the cold of the long winter that had finally begun to lose its grip on the kingdom, but had not yet released the palace itself. The 2 men were Marcus and Tomas, both younger than her by a year, both born in the river towns south of the capital. Marcus had a scar on his chin from a stable accident at 16. Tomas had once gotten so drunk at the harvest feast that he had sung a ballad about her in front of the king, and the king had laughed, and Tomas had sworn to her face the next morning that he would defend her name with his teeth if he had to. Today his teeth were not committed to anything, except staying inside his mouth. He would not look at her, neither would Marcus. Have you ever heard somebody you love say something, friend, and known, before the sentence finished, that the words were not their own? That is the place this story begins. Not in the hall, not in the cell, in a quiet corridor at dawn with 2 boys who had once loved her, and were now too afraid to lift their eyes. The iron at her wrists was cold and too tight. That was on purpose. The cuffs had been forged by a smith who did not know her, on the order of a councilor who knew exactly what shape of cuff bruised the slowest. She had been wearing them for the last 100 steps. The bruising would not come up until the trial was over. By then it would not matter whether her wrists looked tender. Her gown was the gown they had given her to be married in. That was also on purpose. The pearls had been cut off. The collar of doe leather had been stripped to the lining. The hem dragged behind her, dirty at the knees from the ash yard, where the servants had been told to hold her every dawn for the past stretch of cold nights, until the priests had finished whatever they were doing in the moon chamber. She had not been told what they were doing in there. She had been told, by the older servant woman who handled her food, that whatever was happening behind those doors was not something a Luna should ask about. She had stopped being Luna the morning the king had spoken on the obsidian throne, or the morning his mouth had spoken anyway. Her left palm itched. It had begun about 10 steps before the turn for the antechamber. A small bright tap on the line of pale tissue at the heel of her hand. The mark had been on her since girlhood. Her mother had called it 3 things in 3 different years and stopped calling it anything at all by the time Serafine was 12. The mark had never itched before. It was itching now. Marcus stopped at the corridor turn. Tomas stopped beside him. So did she. A new voice came from behind them, brittle with held breath. Move her along, Marcus. The High Councilor is waiting. She knew the voice. Old Brenner, captain of the Inner Watch, a man who had served under 3 councilors and 1 queen mother, and had in his last 15 years perfected the art of saying nothing in front of any of them. Marcus muttered, "Yes, Captain," and the column began to move again. She lifted her chin. She had decided, somewhere around the 4th night of the cell, that whatever came next would not get the gift of her looking small. If they were going to walk her to a crown that burned the lying, she would walk to it with her own posture. A king's word is the spine of the realm. She had read that, as a girl, carved into the lintel of a smaller hall in her father's house. It had sounded grand then. Now it sounded like a riddle. Because a king's word had been the thing that started this. A king's word had stood up in front of 200 witnesses and called her a thing she was not. A king's word had been bent so far out of shape that she had spent the long nights since trying to find a way to fit the new shape over the old man she still remembered. She had failed. She had failed because the new shape did not have anything news about him. She had not, until this morning, allowed herself to consider the other possibility. The doors of the antechamber were 10 paces away. The runes carved into the lintel had been retouched in the last week. Fresh ink, fresh ash. The priests had spent time making sure that the room she was walking into would look untouched by the question of whether the trial was a trial or a closing. The itch at her palm was no longer an itch. It was a small warm tug. She kept her face still. She had learned long ago, in the small ways a girl learns these things, that there was a difference between a body that wanted to react and a face that was allowed to. She kept the difference clean. Marcus could not see her palm warming. Tomas could not see her breath catching. Brenner could not see the way her shoulder blades had drawn tighter under the gown. What none of them could see, what she herself did not yet know, was that the warm tug at her hand had begun the moment a certain blood had stopped flowing on a certain throne. 50 paces ahead of her, in a hall she had not yet entered, a king on his throne was bleeding into the obsidian, and a girl in a torn gown could feel it. The doors opened. She had not stood in the moon altar room since the night of the binding. That had been 2 winters and a spring before the morning of the corridor. She had been 21. Her mother had braided her hair in the Western style and pinned the braids with the pale stone. Serafine had pulled out of the river behind her grandmother's house when she was 9. The stone had been a small clear thing then. By the time she stood in the moon altar room, it had taken on a faint blue color that did not show up in lamplight, only in moonlight, only on the nights the moon was high. Her mother had told her that meant the stone was honest. She had not understood what that meant. She had assumed. It was the kind of thing mothers said when they wanted their daughters to keep something close. Eric had been standing on the other side of the altar. He had not yet been crowned. The old king had died only 3 months earlier, and Eric had been 25 and not yet sure what shape his face was supposed to make. In a room full of people who had stopped being his uncles and started being his subjects, he had stood with his hands at his sides and his pale gray eyes on her, and the moon had come through the high opening in the roof and laid a long bar of cold light across the floor between them. She had walked through the bar of light. He had not moved until she was close enough to touch. Then he had lifted his hand and set the back of his fingers, very gently, against the line of her jaw. "You make me feel." His voice had been quiet, like a man instead of a throne. She had not had an answer for that. She had not needed one. The binding did not require words. The binding required only the willingness of both parties to be seen by each other for who they were when no court was watching. They had been seen. The wolves of the lower courtyard had lifted their heads at exactly the moment the cool air had moved through the altar room, and the old keeper of the moon chamber, the one who had served 4 kings, had made a small sound in his throat that she had not understood until later. The sound had been recognition. The keeper had oath fire in her before anyone in the palace had spoken the word. He had not warned her. That was the part she still could not forgive him for. Not the rejection. The not warning. She had walked back through the bar of light. Eric had followed her. He had walked her, the next morning, under the winter pines, on the eastern slope, where the snow had been clean and the sky had failed, and he had told her again the thing about being a man instead of a throne, and she had believed him with the whole weight of her chest. He had said it once more, 2.5 weeks ago, on a cold afternoon in his private study. That had been the last sentence of his that had sounded like him. The day after that sentence, the council had called him into the moon chamber for what they had named a routine review. The keeper of the chamber had not been present. The doors had been closed with the heavy bar that was usually only used during succession. He had been in that chamber for 9 hours. 9 hours was a long time to be inside a room, with 7 councilors and a high councilor who had spent 40 years collecting reasons. When he had come out, his voice had been wrong. She had heard it that evening at dinner. He had been quiet, which was not unusual. He had been formal, which was. He had said her name once, and the way the consonants had landed in his mouth had been one half step off from the way he had said her name in the corridor that morning. She had asked him if he was tired. He had said yes. She had let it go. People who are about to lose something do that. They let it go. They tell themselves that the shape of a half-step is paranoia. They tell themselves the man they love is just tired. They tell themselves a great many things in the days before the rejection. And they remember every one of those small lies later with a clarity that does not fade. 5 nights after that dinner in the high hall, in front of 200 witnesses, the king of Valorum had stood up and spoken her into a different woman. The night the council house had taken his voice had been the night before that. She had not known. Nobody had told her. She had spent the morning of the rejection braiding her hair the way her mother had taught her, because the High Court was meeting and the Luna of Valorum was expected to be present. Her hands had not shaken. Her stone had been the right color. She had walked into the high hall with the confidence of a woman who believed the man at the front of it would look up when she came in. He had not looked up. She had understood that, too late, on the steps of the throne when the words had begun to leave him. The rejection had taken less than a minute. The cell had taken the long stretch of cold nights that followed. The cuffs had taken 20 paces. The corridor she had just walked down had taken everything else that was left of the woman she had been. She walked through the antechamber. She walked through the second set of doors. The judgment hall opened in front of her. The judgment hall of Valorum had been built in the 2nd century of the kingdom by an architect whose name had been kept out of the official records, because his work had a way of pressing on the people who used it. The hall was circular, 3 stories tall, ringed with stone benches that did not allow a sitter to lean back. The lower benches had been polished by 400 years of council nerves. The upper benches were rougher and reserved for nobles, whose rank required attendance, but whose votes were not counted. Every bench was full. The lamps along the inner ring were burning low. That was a halver choice. The High Councilor preferred a dimmer trial. It made the brazier on the central altar look brighter. It had made the throne at the far end of the hall look further away from the accused. She walked the inlaid silver line that ran from the doors to the center of the floor. She did not look at the benches. She had been told by the older servant woman over a bowl of cold porridge on the 4th night that the worst thing she could do in the morning of the trial was look at the benches. The benches would not look back. The benches would not stand up for her. The benches were filled with people who had spent a week deciding which way to bow, and they had finished deciding before she had even walked in. She looked, instead, at the throne. The throne of Valorum was a single block of obsidian polished so black that it ate the lamplight. 7 jagged points rose from the back of it, each one for one of the original kings. The arms of the throne curled like the forelegs of a wolf at rest. The seat was wide enough for a king to sleep on, which more than one king had done during long sessions. Eric Stormcrown sat at the center of it. He was 28 years old. He looked older than that. His hair was long enough to brush his collar. Unbound for the trial, the dark of it almost wet under the low light. His pale gray eyes were on her. That was the first thing. The court had told him, she knew, to keep his face away from her during the procession. He had not obeyed. His face was on her, and it was a face she did not recognize and recognized at the same time. And the gap between the two was the gap she had been falling into for the last week. The second thing was his right hand. His right hand was closed around the arm of the throne so hard that the knuckles had gone white and then darker. A thin line of blood worked its way down the inside of his fingers, then along the obsidian, then off the front of the seat in a slow, steady drip onto the top step. Nobody on the benches was looking at the blood. She could not tell whether they were not looking at it because they had been instructed not to, or because they had simply decided, the way frightened people decide things, that the blood was not their problem. The third thing was His throat, there was a shadow at his collar, not a bruise, not a sickness. A line, a thin dark stripe under the skin, beneath the high black collar of the ceremonial armor, pulsing once and then again at a rhythm she did not yet have a name for. The rhythm did not match his pulse. She knew this because his pulse, the few times she had laid her hand on his chest in better seasons, had been slow and even. This rhythm was faster. This rhythm was not his. The mark on her palm answered it. A small bright tug, low and clear, like a hand brushing the back of her wrist from a foot away. She set her face. She was good at setting her face. She had been doing it since the second night of the cell. She let nothing of the tug show, but she looked at Eric, and she let her eyes hold on his for one full breath. He saw her see him. He saw, more importantly, that she had begun to see something else around him. His jaw tightened. The blood at his hand thickened. The shadow at his throat squeezed. He did not look away. A man who had freely chosen to reject her would have looked away. She would not have noticed at the time. She would have, until this morning, given him that out. She would have walked the silver line and arrived at the center of the hall, and stood for the reading of the charges and said the things a condemned Luna says when she has decided. The man on the throne is not the man she remembers. She had been ready to do exactly that. She was no longer ready to do exactly that. The tug at her palm made everything before this morning a draft of a story she was no longer going to write. To her left, at the carved oak door of the council bench, Lord Halvor Greymantle stepped into view. He was tall, past 50, iron gray hair pulled back from a high forehead. His robe was the color of weathered stone, and the cuffs were embroidered with the 7 points of the throne, and the embroidery on the right cuff was new. He had replaced it within the last week. The thread was a slightly different gray. He had bought new thread for the morning of the trial. That, she thought, was an interesting choice. She walked the last 6 paces to the inlaid line at the center of the hall, and she stopped on it. Marcus and Tomas stepped back. Brenner, somewhere behind her, drew himself up to a soldier's stillness. Halvor lifted his hand, and the lamps along the inner ring brightened a little. The hall settled into its waiting shape. Bring her forward. His voice carried without effort across the floor. She was already as forward as the silver line allowed. He had not meant her. He had meant the priests at the altar. 2 of them rose from the inner step. They were carrying the brazier. The brazier was bigger than she remembered. She had seen it once before, as a girl, when her father had brought her to a state ceremony. It had been polished and unlit then, a piece of decoration set on a low pedestal at the edge of the altar. It had looked like a wide silver cup with 3 iron legs. She had thought it was for incense. It was not for incense. The 2 priests carried it between them on a thin wooden frame. They set it down 4 paces from where she stood. Old coals had been laid inside it. The coals were not yet glowing. They would not glow until the verdict line was crossed. That was the function of the brazier. It held the heat the hall would need, for whatever the High Counselor decided it would need. Halvor unrolled the charges scroll. He did not need it. Every word in it had been written by him. He had probably watched the calligrapher copy it out 3 days earlier and corrected at least 1 comma. He held the scroll for the back of the room. He held the scroll because a hall like this one expected paper at certain moments, the same way a temple expected incense and a tavern expected song. At Serafine Ashvale, of the Western Marches, his voice rolled across the hall. Last living daughter of the House of Thorn, you stand accused of false bond claim, of oath fraud against the throne of Vealorum, of treason against the sacred mate law, as recorded in the Codex of the 7 Kings. He paused. The pause was a Halvor pause. He had been using it in this hall for 40 years. It was the pause that let a noble in the back row catch up. It was the pause that gave a priest in the front row room to nod. How do you answer the charge? She let him wait. She let him for full breath. Then a second. The silence inside the second breath was the silence of a room that had not been told what to do with a Luna, who was supposed to be crying by now and was not. I do not answer charges, she said. written by the men who fear my answer. A small ripple moved along the inner bench. Halvor did not let his face move. That was one of his trained things. The court will note, his voice climbed a quarter step, that the accused refuses lawful question. Refusal alone is grounds. We will proceed. He turned, slowly, toward the throne. AlphaKing Eric Stormcrown. She watched the king lift his eyes. Do you confirm your rejection? Eric did not move. The shadow at his throat pulsed. The blood on the obsidian thickened by a single, dark line. The hand on the arm of the throne had stopped, somewhere in the last half-minute, even trying to keep itself loose. The bone of his knuckles was visible now under the skin. The hall waited. A king of Velorum did not pause when asked to confirm an oath. The pause was the part the Codex did not have a name for. The pause was the part she had spent the long nights trying to understand the shape of, and she had been wrong about the shape, and the pause was telling her how wrong. Eric's mouth opened. I confirm it. The words sat on the air the way coins sit on cloth. They did not bounce. They did not echo. A true oath rang in a stone hall. A true oath made the lamps move and the wolves below the floor lift their heads. This had neither motion nor weight. This had the sound of a voice carried through somebody else's throat, and only one person in the hall had the ear to hear the carrying. The mark on her palm bit her, a small bright cut of pain, no longer warm, no longer polite. It bit her the way an old dog bites the hand that has been resting on its neck when something new walks into the room. She kept her face still. She had been keeping her face still for so long that the muscles around her jaw had begun to ache. She did not stop now. There would be time to wear her face on the outside later. Right now her face was a wall, and the wall was the only thing between her and the men in this hall and what they had built to do to her. Halvor's eyes had narrowed. He had not heard the hollow. He could not. The codex he had spent his life inside did not include the kind of hearing she had been born with. He had heard, however, the half-breath of her not flinching at her king's confirmation. He filed it. He looked the way a man looks who has been training his face since boyhood, untroubled. He looked the way the hall expected the High Counselor of Velorum to look during a confirmation of rejection, in command. And do you confirm, his voice resumed, that this woman claimed a bond you did not accept? Eric's jaw tightened. He had been ordered to say yes. She knew this without being told. The ordering was as obvious in him as the blood under his hand. He had spent the long stretch of nights in a small room with 7 men deciding the exact wording of the line he would speak now. And the line had been the line, and he had been told to say it. He did not say the line. She claimed a bond, his voice rasped now. The throne does not recognize that. The hall did not catch the substitution. The hall heard the words. The hall heard in the right order. Claim, bond, throne does not recognize. The hall did not hear what was missing. She heard. A man who had freely rejected her would have said, I did not accept the bond she claimed. He would have given Halvor the line. He had given a smaller line. He had given the line his rewritten throat could not stop him from giving. The throne does not recognize. Not him. The throne, the 2 words, sat on her chest like a hand. She drew one slow breath. She let her eyes settle on the High Counselor. And just for a moment, just for the length of one in-breath, she allowed herself the small private knowledge that whatever happened next, the man at the front of this hall had not been the man who had betrayed her. Somebody else had. Halvor turned to the altar. Bring the second piece. His voice was even now, the trial formal voice he saved for the back row. The priests at the altar moved. Not the 2 who had carried the brazier. 2 others, older men, bald-headed, robes the color of soaked ash. They lifted a small bone-pale pedestal from behind the altar and walked it forward, 4 slow paces at a time, the way men carry a thing they have been told not to drop. On the pedestal sat the cinder crown. She had heard of it. Every child raised inside the walls of Velorum had. None of them had expected to see it in person. The kingdom kept the crown, the way it kept the buried catacombs beneath the river quarter, the way it kept the south road sealed in winter, the way it kept a great many things it did not want to talk about in daylight. The band was darkened metal, old silver eaten by something the priests had never quite been willing to name. 7 points rose from the rim, shaped not like the 7 points of the throne, but like the 7 points of a wolf's open jaw. At the center of the band, where a bright stone might have sat in any other crown, sat a piece of pitted moonstone that had not held light in 2 centuries. The stone was the color of a winter pond, gone past freezing into something thicker. Around the inside of the band, where the metal touched the wearer, a thin braid of pale bone had been worked into the silver, wolf bone, from the old line. From a wolf that had served the second king, had been put down by the third, because the second king had loved it too well, and the third king had thought a wolf like that should not outlive the man it loved. She knew the history, because her grandmother had told her. On a night the moon had been high enough to read by, and her grandmother had said, "This is the kind of story you keep, child, because the day will come when you will be in a room with a thing like that, and the room will not tell you what it is." The room was telling her now. The priests set the pedestal down 3 paces from where she stood. Halvor walked forward. He did not lift the crown immediately. He let the hall look at it. He let the back benches feel the weight of what was about to be done. Serafine Ashvale. His voice carried. The Codex of the 7 Kings names this band the final witness. If your claim is true, it will refuse you. If your claim is false, the ash inside it will know. He gave the room another of his pauses. You may yet speak. She looked at him. She did not answer him. She had already given him the only answer that mattered, on the silver line, and he had logged it and moved on. The pause was theater. It was for the hall. It was for the priests who needed to feel the trial had been merciful before they pronounced the part that was not. Then she looked past him one last time. At the throne Eric was sitting forward, not standing. Not yet. Just leaning. The blood under his hand had pooled at the corner of the obsidian seat, and was now running down the front of the throne, in a slow, thin line. The shadow at his throat had darkened by a measurable amount in the last 2 minutes. The pulse of it was faster than it had been when she walked in. He was trying. She did not know yet what trying looked like for a man with that kind of weight at his throat, but she could see it in the muscles along his jaw, in the way the cords of his neck strained against the high collar, in the small involuntary movement of his right shoulder, as if there was something he wanted to reach for and could not. She let him see her see him. She did not nod. She did not soften. She let her eyes hold his for the count of 2 full breaths, and inside those 2 breaths she made him a single private promise. She would not look away. She would not let the band on her head be the last thing he watched her wear. She would walk into whatever the crown wanted from her with her eyes his, hands on his, and if she came out of it, she would come out of it knowing he had been watching, and if she did not come out of it, he would carry that, a knowing for the rest of his life. Then she turned to the band. Halvor lifted it from the pedestal. He used both hands. The metal was heavy, and the heaviness was not natural. The cords of his neck moved when he raised it. He carried it forward, 1 step, and then another, until the inside of the band was an inch above her hair. The cold came off at first, not the cold of metal. The cold of a thing that had been kept somewhere very deep for a very long time. The cold of a winter river the morning it finally stops moving. She did not close her eyes. Halvor lowered the band onto her head. The metal touched her hair. For the length of 1 indrawn breath, nothing happened. Then a great many things happened at once the pitted moonstone at the center of the banded band came back alive. Not red, not gold. A color that did not have a name in Vealorum, that had not been seen in this hall for 200 years. A color that sat somewhere between silver and the white. You see at the bottom of a candle flame, just before the wick catches. The light spread along the band. The braid of bone inside the silver warmed against her scalp. Not enough to burn, just enough to remind her it was there then. The band reached in. It did not reach for her body. The body would have been easy. The body was the part she had already made peace with on the 3rd night of the cell. The band reached past the body and went for the part of her that had walked into this hall, still believing certain people in the room were decent. It went for her trust. Every oath she had ever taken on faith surged up at once. The night of the binding, the promises she had made to her mother on her mother's last good bid day, the morning oath she had sworn as Luna in front of the high priests, with her hand on the moon altar and her stone catching the light. The vow she had given her father at 14, that she would never lie about what she could hear. The band burned through them like a hand running through tall grass. She felt every one of them touched, tested, sorted. The ones she had kept, the band let go. The ones she had broken, the band held onto. There were not many of those, and the ones it found were small, and she had carried them anyway. She had told her mother, at 13, that she did not remember the village. That had been the largest of them. The band held that one for a long beat. Then it set it down. The hall around her began to scream, not her. Not yet. A noble in the second bench made a small wet sound and clutched at his throat. Black smoke came out of his mouth. He coughed once, and a folded slip of parchment fell from between his teeth, scorched at the edges, and was on fire before it hit the floor. A signed land bond. One he had backdated last summer to claim a stretch of the Twent road that had not been his to claim. A priest in the front row clapped his palms over his ears and bent double. The blessing he had spoken over the rejection scroll a week earlier was burning out of the inside of his hands. 3 councilors at the inner bench stood at once, because their oath rings had begun to drip onto their fingers. A guard captain at the back of the room dropped his blade. The blade had been sworn to protect the innocent. He had brought her in chains anyway. The blade was now too hot to hold. The hall filled, very quickly, with the smell of burned parchment, burned silver, and a sharper underlying smell she did not want to name. She was standing. The band was on her head. The band had not refused her. The band had decided something else. The band had decided that the woman wearing it was the witness it had been waiting for, and the things it had been built to burn would burn through her on their way out. The cost arrived in her chest, low and steady. Not pain. Subtraction. The first thing the band took from her was the assumption that the kingdom she had walked into was the kingdom her father had taught her to love. The assumption did not break. It simply stopped being a thing she could stand on. She would have to find a new place to put her, and she would never get that one back. The mark on her left palm split. A line side of silver ran up the inside of her arm. The black iron at her wrists groaned, then sagged, then dropped to the floor in 2 heavy splashes of cooled metal. Marcus took a step back. Tomas put his hand on the hilt of his blade and then took it off again because his fingers begun to shake. She lifted her head. She looked across the hall. She looked at the throne. Eric was on his feet. She did not know when he had stood. The hall had been too busy with its own burning to mark the moment. But he was up. One hand pressed flat against his chest, the other braced on the wolf curve of the throne arm. And the shadow at his throat was no longer a line. It was a chain, 7 black links, wrapped twice around his neck, pulsing in time with whatever was left of the rejection script he had been forced to carry inside his own voice for the long week behind the chamber door. She saw it the hall, in the chaos of its own burning, did not. The chain ended at the back of his neck in a small black knot the size of a thumb. The shape of the knot was old. She knew the shape. Her grandmother had drawn a knot like that, once, in the ash by the hearth, as part of a story about the second king and the men who had served him. The story had been about a trap. The trap had been built to choke. Here is what nobody on those benches had been willing to ask. A man's voice is the way he holds himself up. When somebody else starts writing the words that come out of it, the man is still standing, but the body on the throne is not really the body anymore. It is a chair somebody else has been sitting in. For the long week behind the chamber door, somebody had been sitting in Eric, and he had been the only person in the kingdom who could not say so out loud, because the chain around his throat had been built to choke him every time he tried. She drew one slow breath. She held it. Then she lifted her bleeding left hand, palm out, and she pointed at the chain. Her voice carried. Crowns do that, even cursed ones. That, she said, whose hand tied that? The hall did not answer her. The hall could not. Halvor had taken half a step backward. Two of the older priests at the altar had simply sat down. A handful of nobles on the upper benches had begun to look at each other in the small, panicked way men look at each other when they have not been told what to do next. The silver fire on her palm did not wait for an answer. It dropped from her hand to the marble at her feet. It did not move like a flame. It moved like a hound that had been kept on a short lead for too long and was finally being asked to work. It put its head down. It put its nose to the floor. And then it began to walk. It walked the inlaid silver line of the floor in reverse, back the way she had come, then turned at the antechamber threshold and came back the other way. Weaving between benches, brushing the hem of one robe, lifting along the foot of one boot, ignoring most of the men in the hall, the way a working dog ignores everything that is not the scent it has been sent for. It was looking for sources. She felt every step of it inside her chest, because the band on her head and the silver on the floor were the same fire, and she was the channel between them. Every oath in the hall it brushed against, she felt. Every thread of promise, broken or kept, ran through her on its way to being weighed. The fire judged. She paid the toll. The threads, once she could see them, were of three kinds. The silver ones were the cleanest. There were not many. A serving girl at the back of the hall, who had promised Harmer, Drungdark brother, she would not lie about her wages, and had kept the promise for 9 years. A young noble in the third bench named Edric, who had not yet been asked to break anything, and had not yet learned how easy breaking was. A priest at the altar, whose throat threads were entirely clean because he had stopped speaking Smekis on this hall 5 years ago after the last private execution, and had decided silence was the only oath he could keep without bleeding. The gray ones were most of the room. A gray thread was not a lie. A gray thread was an oath that had softened. Marriages held together by habit. Loyalties spoken once at a coronation and never tested afterward. Most of the nobles wore gray threads at their hearts, the way a man wears an old coat. They had not betrayed anything in particular. They had also not stood up for anything in particular. The band on her head did not punish the gray. The band on her head only marked it. She would remember the marks. The black threads were the ones the fire was hunting. There were 6 of them, 3 on the inner council bench, on the 3 councilors, whose rings had already begun to drip, 1 on the priest at the altar, who had blessed the rejection scroll, 1 on the guard captain at the back, who had brought her in chains under a sworn oath to protect the innocent. The 6th was on Lord Halvor Greymantle. It was the deepest black she had seen yet. The thread ran out of his chest, down his right arm, and ended at the silver oath ring on his hand. There was knot in the thread an inch above the ring. The knot was the same shape as the knot at the back of Eric's neck. She did not move toward him. Not yet. The silver fire reached the foot of his robe. It did not climb. It sat down at his hem the way a hound sits when it has caught a scent, and has been trained to wait for the next order, the hall saw. The hall did not need to be told what the sitting meant. Members of the court, Halvor's voice was steady, but his cuffs had moved slightly because the cords in his forearms had tightened. This fire is not lawful. The Codex does not provide for a witness band to send hunting fire across an open hall. Whatever is happening at my feet is the corruption of the trial. I will not have my position challenged by an animal a corrupted band has invented. I will, she said. He did not look at her. The priests at the altar will lift the band. His voice did not climb. And the trial will reconvene in 7 days under the Codex Review provision. Nobody at the altar moved. The priests at the altar had been watching the silver firewalk. 2 of them had been watching the threads on their own chests, which had begun to glow faintly in shades they did not want to see. A third had been watching the captain of the inner watch, who had been Brenner's mentor 12 years ago, and was no longer the same man he had been then. None of them was about to step forward and put their hands on a band that had just announced what it could do. She felt the cost mount in her chest. The band took something from her. Each time the fire touched a black thread, it was not pain. It was not memory in the strict sense. It was something more particular than that. It was the way she had always given strangers the benefit of the doubt. The first time the fire touched the noble's ring, she felt that habit thin. The second time, on the captain of the watch, the habit went a little further. By the time the silver hound reached Halvor's hem, she had spent enough of her trust to know she was not going to spend the rest of her life walking into rooms the way she had walked into this one. She would walk into them with a count. Always. Every face she met. Every voice she heard. The had cost not stop the work. She had decided, somewhere on the fourth night of the cell, that whatever the morning asked her to spend, she would spend. She walked forward. She walked the silver line from the inlaid mark at the center of the hall to the place where Halvor stood at the council bench. The hall watched her come. The fire at his hem stood up as she approached, and laced itself, slowly, around her ankles, then her shins, then her waist, until her whole body was lit from the floor, up with the pale flame that had walked across the hall to find him. She stopped 3 paces from him. The chain on Eric, behind her, had loosened by a fraction. The shadow at his throat was darker than ever, but the rhythm had slowed. The band on her head was eating the surrounding lies, and the chain, somehow, had begun to feed on the same source. She did not yet understand the link. She would understand it in a few minutes. Halvor met her eyes, Lady Ashvale. His voice was almost gentle. "You do not know what you are touching." "I am touching," she said, "the ring on your hand." He smiled. Not a warm smile, a correction smile. The kind a teacher uses when a student has answered a question the teacher had not expected to be answered. "You are touching," he said, "the High Counselor of Vealorum. There is a difference." There was a difference. She agreed there was a difference. But the band on her head and the silver line on her palm and the 4 nights of cold porridge and the 7 cold dawns of being held in the Oshard had taught her that differences of that kind were the exact things that built the codex he had spent 40 years applying. She was tired of differences. She had become, somewhere between the binding and the cuffs, a woman who measured a man not by his office, but by the threads at his chest. His threads were black, and the thread had a knot in it the same shape as the knot at Eric's neck. She did not need a codex to read that. He did not move. She did not move. Then he did the thing she had not expected. He reached, very carefully, into the inside of his stone-colored robe and drew out a small scroll. "You think," he said. "You understand who you are. Let me show you who you are." The scroll opened in the air before it hit the floor. She had seen council magic before. The hall had embedded rites for moments like this. Scribe's ink that drew itself across stone for important announcements. Old echo wards that let a counselor's voice carry into the lower hall. This was different. The scroll did not open for the room. The scroll opened for everyone in the room at once, behind their eyes, the way a memory opens. She felt vision arrive before she saw it. Then she saw it. A village. Stone houses banked against a winter slope. Smoke rising from a half-dozen chimneys. A bell tower at the center, small, with a single dark bell. The kind of settlement that did not have a name on any palace map, and did not need one because the men in the palace had decided long ago that the village had nothing they wanted. The village had something they wanted. A girl in the village square, 5 years old maybe. White nightgown gone gray at the hem, bare feet. Silver blonde hair untidy, half pulled back with a strip of leather. A streak of soot along the line of her left cheek. 3 alpha males on the ground in front of her. Wolves in their shifted form. Northern bloodline, by the size of them. The kind of men who walked into rooms and made rooms quieter. All 3 of them dead. No claw marks, no bite. The fur unmarked. Snow under each one, beginning to melt in a slow circle, as if something had passed through the bodies on its way out of the world. The girl was not crying. The girl was holding her left palm out, the way a child holds her hand out to feel. Rain. A pale line of silver light ran from the heel of her hand up the inside of her wrist, the same line that ran on Serafine now. The hall gasped. A noble in the upper benches whispered a name she had not heard out loud in the palace before. Karen. The village. The name Halvar had not yet spoken. The vision sharpened. The fur on the 3 dead alphas now showed the small embroidered crests of their houses. House Vey, House Moore, House Stem, 3 of the 4 southern houses, 3 border courts, 3 sworn alphas. She did not remember the morning. She had not allowed herself to remember it, for the same reasons children do not allow themselves to remember mornings like that. She had been told, by her mother, that the men in fur had come to take her mother. She had been told to stay in the cellar until grandmother came. She had stayed. The vision was telling her that the men in fur had not come for her mother. The men in fur had come for her. The southern courts had heard a rumor. A child of the old Thorn line, alive, hidden in a village under a stretch of poor mountain country. They had sent 3 sworn alphas to confirm the rumor and bring the child south. The rumor had been true. The child had been 5. The child had walked out of her own front door barefoot and met the 3 men in the square because her mother had not been able to stop her. The child had not screamed. The child had lifted her left hand. The 3 men had been dead before the second of their names had finished speaking. She watched her own younger face in the vision. 5 years old, soot along the cheek. The hand still out, the pale silver line on her palm not yet fading. There was no expression. The child had not understood what had been done. The child had only understood that the men had been about to take her, and they were no longer about to take her. Her mother had hidden her in the cellar for the rest of that winter. Her mother had told her, every night for 3 weeks, that the men in furs were still coming. Her mother had been lying. The men in fur had been very dead. Her mother had been trying to keep her in the cellar until the kingdom forgot the village had ever been there. She felt the second cost rise in her chest. The first cost taken the assumption that her kingdom was decent. The second cost was taking the assumption that her mother had told her the truth. It was not a clean cost. Her mother had been afraid. Her mother had been doing what her mother could think of to keep her alive. The lie had not been malicious. The lie had been an act of love. The band on her head did not care about the difference. The band on her head only marked what was true. She lifted her eyes from the vision. She looked at Halvor. He had been watching her face. He had been waiting for the moment the vision finished. Because a vision, like that one, has a particular silence at the end of it, and the High Counselor of Vealorum had timed many speeches off that silence. Members of the court, his carried. The woman you see standing before me is not the last living daughter of the House of Thorn. That name has been a polite fiction for a generation. The bloodline she carries is older than the throne she nearly mated. It is the Oathfire line, the line that burned 3 royal courts in the years before our kingdom had a name. The line we were told had ended in the fire at Karan 20 winters ago, in a village so small that the names of the men it killed were quietly removed from the southern records to spare 3 royal houses the embarrassment of admitting they had sent sworn alphas after a child. He paused. A long pause this time. She is not, his voice was almost regretful, an accused Luna. She is an inheritance. She is the thing our second king's grandfather warned us would come back. She has the band on her head, not because the band failed, but because the band recognized what it was being asked to judge. The band did not refuse her. The band waited for her. A counselor at the inner bench actually crossed himself. A different noble in the 3rd row stood. Then sat down again. Then put his hand on his own oath ring and held it there, as if to keep it from coming off. She watched the room turn. She had felt rooms turn before, small ones, her own welcome feast, when a serving man had spilled wine on her gown. And the noblewomen at the long table had decided, in the small ways noblewomen decided things, whether they would laugh at her or with her. They had decided with her. She had remembered the moment for a long time after. This was not that kind of turning. This was the turning of a room that had been about to feel pity for her, and had just been given permission to feel afraid of her instead. Pity she could have used. Fear she could not. Fear was the soil Halvor had been farming his whole working life. She let the room finish its turn. She did not interrupt. She did not raise her hand. She had learned long ago, in the small ways a daughter learns, that you do not stop a man in mid-speech when he believes he is winning. You let him finish. You let the words come out of him. You give him enough of his own line that he will tangle in it. Halvor was not yet tangled. He was almost there. The hall, he said, has now heard what no codex meeting has been willing to speak aloud since the second king. There has not been a single Oathfire woman allowed to mate a king of Vealorum since the founding. There have been candidates. There have been infiltrations. There have been 400 years of careful refusal. The codex has held. Tonight, in this hall, we very nearly broke that refusal. King Eric was 4 nights from a public mating ceremony when the council intervened. 4 nights. The intervention has been ugly. The intervention has been costly. The intervention has been necessary. He turned his face, briefly, toward the throne. The king's voice was corrected, because the king's voice was about to commit the kingdom to a Luna, who would not have been a Luna at all. She would have been a fire on the throne. She would have heard every private oath the council needed to keep private, to keep this kingdom in one piece. She would have ruled, in a year, not by signing law but by burning the men who could not keep their words clean enough to survive her. A kingdom cannot live under a witness like that. The Codex says so. The Codex was written by men who watched 3 kingdoms try. The band on her head was very quiet. She did not know yet why it was quiet. It had been busy a moment ago. The hound at her hem had been waiting. Now the band had gone still, the way a creature goes still when it has heard a sentence it intends to remember. She let the band be still. She spoke instead. So you said 3 courts turned, slowly, back to her. I did name them. A pause. Karen is not a court. Karen is a village. The vision you just showed the hall, she said, was not the burning of a court. The vision was 3 sworn alphas sent to take a child. You used a village to make the room think you were showing a war. You did not name the courts because the courts you mean are old, and the names are inconvenient. Name them. He held her eyes. He did not name them. She had not expected him to. She had expected him to do what he did, which was to choose, in the small heartbeat of the silence, a slightly different attack. The hall, she said, can hear you not naming them. A noble in the upper benches actually leaned forward. The names of the courts, Halvor's voice took the higher level now, are recorded in the Codex's private appendix, which is held in the Southern Archive under a seal that only the High Counselor and the King may break. To speak the names in an open trial would itself be treason under the Codex. The court will understand. The court did not understand. She watched 2 of the upper bench nobles look at each other, in the small panicked way men look at each other when they have just realized the law. Their counselor has been quoting them at is a law. Their counselor has personally sealed. A king of Vealorum, she said, can break the seal. She turned, she looked at Eric. The chain on his throat had loosened a measurable amount in the last 2 minutes. The shadow was still there. The rhythm was slower. The band on her head, and whatever balance she had struck with the silver fire on her palm, had bought him air, not freedom, air. He was standing on the 2nd step of the throne now. He had moved without anybody noticing. His pale gray eyes were on her. She did not ask him out loud. She did not need to. He had been a man who could read her face since the morning under the winter pines, and the chain at his throat had not yet taken that from him. He answered her question without speaking. He lifted his bleeding right hand. Then he turned the palm outward, fingers spread, in the old sign that every child raised in a wolf court learned before they could read. Break the seal. The High Counselor turned to him so fast that the embroidered cuff caught on the edge of the council bench. Your Majesty, Eric said. The names. Now his voice was rough. It was also his own voice, mostly, for the first time since the rejection. The chain bit. The blood at his hand thickened. The blood at the corner of his mouth opened a thin new line. He did not stop. He took a half step forward. The names, he said again. She watched the High Counselor try to decide whether to disobey. He did not have long to decide. The hall had heard the king. The hall had heard the king sound like the king. The hall, having spent the last 6 dawns of the long week being told of the king's voice, was the voice of a man choosing his line, was watching the king choose a different line in front of them, and the line was a line they did not yet the words to, but which they recognized in their bones. Halvor opened his mouth. The names of the 3 courts, he said, and the precision in his voice did not entirely hide what the precision was costing him. Our House Aranel of the Southern Bend, House Vey of the Cold Reach, and House Moore of the River Fork. The hall did not move. She did not move either. But she did the work in her head fast, because the band on her head was helping her now. And the band on her head had a long memory. House Vey and House Moore were the 2 of the 3 crests on the dead men in the vision. The 3rd dead man, in the vision, had borne the crest of House Stem. House Aranel had not been at Karen. She let the silence stretch. Then she let the question into the air. Gently, the way you let a small animal out of a cage. So the 3rd court, she said. In the vision was wrong. A counselor on the inner bench made a small noise in his throat. Halvor did not answer. I am asking, she said, because the vision you showed this hall had 3 dead alphas with 3 different crests. The crests on the dead were Vey, Moore, and Stem. The list you just gave names Aranel instead of Stem. So either the vision was a lie, or the list is a lie, or you have just named 4 courts. The hall heard her count to 4 out loud. A noble in the upper benches mouthed Stem under his breath, as if checking the math against his own memory. Halvor's right hand moved, not to draw a weapon. He had not carried a weapon in this hall in 20 years. His right hand moved toward the silver oath ring on his finger. The gesture small, the gesture almost not a gesture. The gesture of a man checking that his ring was still where he had left it. She saw the hand move. She saw the band on her head, making it bright as a candle at midnight. The black thread that ran from the ring up into his chest pulse once. A small bright pulse. Not from the ring. From inside it. The ring was holding something. The ring was holding the thing he was reaching for. She set her feet. She did not let her face show that she had seen. But she made him a private promise as he closed his hand round the band on his finger. Whatever was in the ring, she was going to bring it out, into the air of the hall, and the hall was going to see it. And the man who had spent 40 years walking on the Codex was going to find out what it felt like to stand on the other side of a witness who did not need a Codex to know what she was looking at. She drew one slow breath. Then she lifted her bleeding palm, and she set the silver fire loose a second time, not on the floor, on him. The fire did not move the way it had moved on the floor. On the floor it had walked. It had been patient. It had been a tracking animal, asked to find a smell. On Halvor it climbed. The silver lit at the hem of his robe, and ran up the inside of the stone-colored cloth the way water runs up a wick. Fast. Bright. Without asking. He did not move. He was a man trained not to move in this hall. He had built a 40-year career on the small theatrical stillness of refusing to react. He held the stillness now, the way a man holds his breath underwater. And she could see, the band on her head making it visible, that he was counting the seconds the way a man counts when he has been told the lung gives out at 60. The fire reached his chest. It paused there. It did not burn. It read. She felt the reading through her own ribs, because the band and the fire were one thing, and she was the channel, and she felt every layer of Halvor unfold under the pale silver glow, the way a folded letter unfolds. The man had been honest with himself. That was the part she had not expected. 40 years of preserving a codex he had not fully believed in. 40 years of telling himself, the men who had written the 7 Kings' Law, had known a thing about oathfire women that the kingdom would forget at its peril. 40 years of repeating the sentence until the sentence had become a person, and the person had become him. And there was no longer a clean way to separate the man from the codex. She would, later, find that almost sad. She was not later yet. The fire reached his right hand. It paused at the silver ring. Then it did not burn the ring. It went into the ring. The hall stopped breathing. It was a quiet stopping, not the kind that has sound. The kind of stopping that makes a stone room 10 degrees colder for one half breath. The kind a hall does when it has just understood that the next thing it sees is going to make the rest of its day a different shape. The ring cracked. It did not explode. It did not melt. It split, very neatly, along a seam that no jeweler had ever cut into it, and the band of silver opened around the small black stone at its center, and the inside of the ring became visible to the room. For the first time since the day Halvor had been given it as a young man. Something rose out of it, a coil of script bright as held breath. Written in ash thread, no larger than a child's handwriting, suspended in the air a handspan above his palm. The script began to play, not silently, out loud, in a voice the hall recognized before the second word. I reject this woman as Luna of Valorum. I deny her claim. I name her false. It was Eric's voice. It was Eric's voice from a week ago on this throne, at this hour in this hall, with the exact catch in the third syllable that she had been trying for the long stretch of nights to convince herself had been grief, and not something worse. The script played the line. Then it played it again. Then it played it a third time, each play softer than the last, like a recording being pulled back into the ring after being checked. The hall understood, slowly, in the way a hall understands the worst things, what they were hearing. Not a memory, not a record. A copy. The ring was a vault. The ring had been used to bottle the words. The ring had been carried on the High Councilor's finger for the long week, ready to be played back to the chain at Eric's throat the moment the chain showed any sign of weakening. Every time Eric had tried to reach for her in the privacy of his own quarters, every time he had tried to send a guard down to the cell, every time he had attempted to draft a single line of correction to the rejection scroll, the ring had hummed against Halvor's hand and the chain had tightened. The leash had been built to feed on the king's love for her. The more Eric had loved her in the long week, the more the chain had been able to choke him. Eric understood it in the same heartbeat she did. She heard the sound he made. It was not a word. It was the small, wrecked sound of a man who has just learned that the worst hours of his last week were the hours he had spent trying to fight for the woman he loved, and the fight had been the engine of the muzzle. The chain at his throat tightened. She turned. She did not think. She crossed 3 paces toward the throne. The band on her head warned her. In the small, bright way the band warned her now about every move. That to touch him before the ring was finished would let the rejection script copy itself into him again. She stopped at the edge of the warning. The fire on her palm reached, instead, for the air around his throat, and the silver of it laced into the shadow of the chain, and the chain bit the silver instead of him. He drew a breath he had not been allowed to draw in a week. His shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch. He looked at her. I am sorry. His voice was small. But do not, she said, be sorry yet. Be sorry when there is time. She turned back to Halvor. The ring had sealed itself. The crack along the band had knit closed. The script had folded itself back inside the silver. The hall had heard. The hall had seen. The hall had the last full minute staring at the High Councilor of Valorum, the way men stare at a structure that has been holding up the ceiling above their heads and has just shown them the rust along its main beam. Halvor closed his hand around the ring. You bottled him, she said. I preserved the kingdom. You bottled his voice, and you walked the halls with it on your finger, and you played it back at him every time he tried to choose me. The Codex requires the High Councilor. His voice did not climb yet to hold a corrected oath for 30 days in a sealed vessel. The ring is a vessel. The vessel has been used by every High Councilor since the second king. It is procedure. It is not a crime. It is procedure, she said, that lets you weaponize a man's voice against himself. He did not answer. She did not need him to. The hall had heard. The hall had counted, the way she had counted out loud a few minutes earlier. And the math was no longer math the hall could pretend not to follow. A counselor at the inner bench stood. He had not yet spoken in the trial. He had been one of the three whose oath rings had melted at the start. He held the bare circle of his finger up, now the skin still red where the silver had cooled. I do not, his voice cracked, want to live under a codex that lets a man store the king's voice in a piece of jewelry. He sat back down. He did not look at Halvor. He looked at the floor. A second counselor on the same bench made a small sound that was almost agreement, almost not, and put his hand over his face. A noblewoman in the third row, the embroiderer's wife who had stitched a sash for Seraphine's welcome ceremonies, 2 went past, set her hand on her son's shoulder and pressed once. The small pressure of a mother telling a boy to remember the morning. The room was turning a second time. Halvor felt it turn. He had spent 40 years turning rooms. He knew what a turn felt like from the inside, and what it cost to turn one back. He did not, this time, turn it back. He took one slow step backward instead. The small, careful step a man takes when he has decided the floor he is standing on is no longer the floor he counted on. His boot landed on a tile near the throne. The tile was not a tile. She saw it light, faintly, under the leather of his boot. She did not yet know what it was. She would know in about 30 seconds. The lighting was a small pale square along the seam of the polished marble. Faint, the kind of glow a man might mistake for a lamp reflection if a lamp had been in the right place. There was no lamp in the right place. The glow had come from beneath the floor. She watched Halvor look down. He looked down for a long half-second, the way a man looks at a sound he had not expected to make. Then he did not move his boot. He lifted the other foot, set it down beside the first, and brought his heel onto the seam. It was a small motion. It was not a small motion. The hall did not see the difference. The hall had been busy with the ring. The hall had been busy with the second counselor. The hall had been busy, more than anything, with the slow private accounting that every man and woman on the benches had begun to run inside their own chests about what they had said, what they had signed, what they had not stood up for. In the long days of the chain, she saw the difference. The band on her head saw it. The mark on her palm saw it. The silver fire that had climbed up Halvor and was now hanging at his shoulders saw it too, and the fire dropped, all at once from his shoulders to the floor and ran in a tight pale circle. Around the tile his heel had pressed. She turned to Eric. "The throne," she said. He did not understand. He had not seen the tile light. "Get off the throne," she said. Now he moved, not fast. He could not. The chain at his throat was loosened but not gone, and his body had been bleeding for the better part of an hour, and a man who has bled for an hour does not move fast. He did, however, move. He took the steps of the throne one at a time, his left hand on the obsidian arm, and he came down onto the marble of the hall floor for the first time in the long week. He did not stand near her. He could not yet. The band on her head still kept the warning at the edge of her skull that to be close to him before the chain finished its work was to risk reigniting the script in his throat. He stopped 4 paces from her. Behind him, the throne sat empty. The marble beneath the throne split. It was not a crack. It was a seam, a thin black line that ran from the front of the dais along the floor, all the way to the spot under Halvor's heel, and then forked into a circle around a wider patch of stone at the center of the hall. A breath of cold air came up out of the seam. The breath did not smell like the brazier ash on the altar. The breath did not smell like the wolf bone on the band. The breath smelled like a thing kept somewhere very deep for a very long time. Older than the council. Older than the throne. The smell that comes up out of a vault that has not been opened in long enough that the people who made the vault are no longer alive. The marble at the foot of the throne broke open. Something rose from beneath it. A stone tablet, black, pitted, the width of a man's chest, the height of a young child, suspended on a faint column of pale gold light that did not have a source the eye could find. Lines of small old script ran across the face of it. 200 at least, glowing faintly, the way a thin line of embers glows in the floor of a fireplace at dawn. She knew, before she read a word of it, what she was looking at. Halvor had not summoned the Codex of the 7 Kings. He had summoned the thing the Codex was based on, The original writing. The first law. The tablet buried beneath the floor of every judgment hall in Valorum, so that no councilor would ever have to defend its in open court. The tablet had a name in private council records. The tablet was the buried hand. She had heard of it once. From her grandmother. Her grandmother had drawn the symbol of it in the ash by the hearth, the same way she had drawn the knot of the chain. And her grandmother had said, "This is the thing, the men in stone robes will use the day they cannot win in daylight, child, and you should know what it looks like before you ever stand in a room with it." The tablet steadied at chest height, the pale gold light dimmed slightly as it settled. The first line at the top was easy enough to read in the dim light. She read it twice on the matter of the oath fire line and the keeping of kings from their mistake. She let the line sit. She did not turn to Eric. She did not turn to Halvor. She let the hall read it for itself. The hall, in the way halls do at moments like this, was not breathing. A noble in the third row mouthed the word mistake the way a man mouths a word he is trying to fit against his own father. Halvor recovered first. He had always recovered first. That was the part of him that had survived 4 kings. Members of the court, his voice came back to its old shape. The codex you have lived under for 200 years is not the original law. The original law is older. The original law was written by the first 3 kings of Valorum, 3 men who had each lost a court to an oathfire bride in the years before the union of the houses. The original law is on this tablet. The original law does not allow what the hall is about to be asked to allow. The original law is binding. The original law has been binding since before any of us drew our first breath, and it does not require a vote. He took 1 step toward the tablet. "I am calling," he said, on the buried hand to confirm the trial. She did not move. She did not need to. The tablet had begun to read itself. It was a thin sound at first, not a voice. Closer to wind through a narrow passage. The pale gold runes along the face of the tablet glowed in sequence, line by line, and the air around them filled in with a half-shaped whisper that was, the more she listened. 1,000 whispers laid one over the other. The whispers were the men who had written the lines. The whispers were the men who had read them after, in the long centuries of the codex. The tablet was not a tablet. The tablet was a record of every voice that had ever stood in agreement with what was carved into it. The room would soon hear the agreement out loud. She turned to Eric. "I am going to ask you to do one thing," she said. "I am not going to ask you to choose me. I will not ask that of a man with a leash still at his throat. I am going to ask you to put your bleeding hand on the tablet." He nodded. He did not speak. He did not need to. He walked the 4 paces. The hall watched him come. The High Councilor said, sharply, "Your Majesty, the Codex forbids." Eric did not turn his head. He kept walking. He reached the front of the throne. He reached the broken marble. He lifted his right hand, the one that had been bleeding since the start of the morning, and he laid it, palm flat, across the runes. The tablet drank his blood. The runes brightened. The whisper at the edges of the tablet steadied into a single voice. And then, very slowly, somewhere beneath the floor of the judgment hall, the ash that had been waiting in the buried vault for 400 years began to move. It rose first as a thin gray thread, a single column of pale dust, no thicker than a wrist, lifting out of the seam at the center of the hall, and turning, in the air, a man-height above the broken marble, the way a wind turns when it has not yet decided which way it intends to go. The column thickened. It split. It became 2 columns, then 4, then 7, and each of the 7 thickened in turn, until 7 gray columns stood in a half-ring around the floating tablet. The columns took shape. They did not take shape fast. The dead do not hurry. The columns settled, slow as a snowfall in reverse, into the outlines of 7 men. The men wore armor. The men wore crowns. The armor did not gleam. The crowns did not glitter. The armor was the soft worn gray of metal that has been kept underground for a long time, and the crowns were not metal at all. The crowns were grown into the skulls. The crowns and the skulls were the same bone, the bone of men whose heads had been opened in the last days of the founding. to make room for the laws they had written. She had not been told that part as a child. Her gra never had not known that part. Her grandmother had drawn the symbol of the buried hand in the ash by the hearth, and her grandmother had said, "Man who writes a law that big does not keep his skull." But her grandmother had thought she was being colorful. She had not been being colorful. The first kings had paid for the codex with the tops of their heads. The 7 dead kings of Valorum opened their eyes. The eyes did not have pupils. They had a low pale gold light that did not blink, and did not move, and did not respond to a hand waved in front of them, the way a candle does not respond. The largest of the 7 turned its head, slowly, toward her. Its voice did not come out of its mouth. The voice arrived inside the hall the way weather arrives, without permission. A Luna, who hears the breaking of oaths, does not sit beside the throne. The band on her brow pulsed once. A small bright warning. The dead were not the same as the living. The dead could not be argued with. The dead were not interested in her answer. The dead were interested in whether they would be obeyed. She did not lower her head. She had spent the morning learning the cost of lowering her head. The cost had not paid her back. A Luna who hears the breaking of oaths, she said, is what is standing in front of you. You can decide what that means. The room has already decided what it is going to do. The dead king did not move. The second one turned its skull. The third followed. 3 faces with no faces had now found her, and she felt the weight of the 3 of them across her shoulders, the way a woman feels the weight of an unfamiliar coat she has been given by a stranger who has decided she will be cold. Behind her, Eric drew a slow breath. He had taken his hand off the tablet. The runes were still lit. The light along the buried writing did not need him anymore. It had taken what it needed when his blood had touched the stone. He took 1 step forward. He did not walk to her. He walked to a place beside her, 2 paces off to her left, not behind, not in front. He stopped there. The dead kings did not turn to him. He did not yet matter to them. They were not in this hall for the king. They were in this hall for the Luna. That was, she would think later, the part the Codex had always gotten wrong. The Codex had been written about kings. The Codex had assumed the danger was the king's choice. The Codex had not understood that the woman in the room had a vote. She drew a slow breath. She lifted her chin. The cinder crown chose me, she said. The buried hand was opened by the king. The hall has heard the bottled voice in the high councilor's ring. You are not here to decide whether I am false. You are here because the law you wrote 400 years ago is being read aloud by the room above your heads for the first time since you were buried. The largest dead king did not answer. She had not expected it to. It turned its head, instead, toward Halvor. You called us. Its voice arrived without sound, and the law that called us is yours to defend. Halvor stepped forward. He had been waiting for this exact moment. He had been counting the seconds the way she had been counting the threads. He had spent his 40 years building the small, narrow staircase that led to the spot he was about to stand on. He stood on it. He turned to the hall. Members of the court. His voice climbed back into the old high shape. You have heard the buried hand. You have heard the voice of the first kings. You have heard, in plain words, the law that built the throne above our heads. The Oathfire line cannot mate a king of Valorum. The law is older than my service. The law is older than the codex you have lived under. The law is the floor of the kingdom. I did not write it. I have only enforced it. I have enforced it through correction, through chain, through the bottled oath, and tonight through the buried tablet, because the law required me to. I will not apologize for what the law required. He turned toward the 7 witnesses, he said. I ask the buried hand to confirm the rejection. I ask the buried hand to bind the king to the law his ancestors wrote. I ask the buried hand to remove the cinder crown from the head of an Oathfire woman who was never meant to wear it. The 7 did not answer, not yet. She watched the silence. She watched Halvor wait. She watched, with a slow, cold knowing in her chest, the band on her head start to take the second largest cost it had taken yet. It was taking the assumption that a man who had spent 40 years inside a law could be reasoned out of it. She had walked into the hall this morning, still believing, somewhere far down, that men like Halvor were the way they were, because nobody had ever sat them down and asked them the right question. She had believed, in the quiet way a woman raised on her father's books believed things, that even the worst counselor in the kingdom was still a man, and a man could be reached if you knew the road. The band took the belief. It did not break the belief. It just stopped letting her stand on it. She would have to find a different road for men like him. Most of the rest of her life, she suspected, was going to be that road. The cost paid, she let the belief go. She turned to face the seven. "You will not," she said. Confirmed the rejection. The largest dead king did not move. She watched its empty eyes for the small flicker that meant it was listening. The flicker did not come. The dead did not listen the way the living listened. The dead were not a council. The dead were a weight. The weight was either lifted or it was not. The weight was, at the moment, hanging in the air of the hall above their heads, deciding whether to come down on her side or his. She drew a slow breath. Then she put her right hand, palm down, on the buried tablet beside Eric's. The runes brightened. Her blood was already on the stone, from the cut along her palm where the silver had opened the scar. She did not need a fresh wound. The tablet had her. The tablet read her the way the band on her head had read the hall. She let the tablet read. What the tablet read, she would understand only afterwards, was that the law had been written by men. The first 3 kings had written it, then 4 counselors had refined it. Then 100 clerks across 400 years had recopied it. Not one of the hands that had touched the tablet had been an oath fire hand. The law had never been read. Until this morning. By the thing the law had been written about. She was the thing the law had been written about. She was reading. She would write something at the bottom of that tablet, before the morning was done, that the hands of the first kings had never thought to forbid. She did not yet know what it would say. The tablet would help her find the words. The 7 dead kings began, very slowly, to turn back toward her. They did not turn fast. She had time, in the slow arc of the 7 skulls coming around, to understand the shape of the hall she was now standing in. The shape was not the shape she had walked into. The shape had changed in the last hour the way a room changes when the people inside it have learned a thing they cannot unlearn. The hall was no longer the trial. The hall had become the witness. Behind her, on the benches, the embroiderer's wife was holding her son's shoulder so tightly, her knuckles were white. The second counselor, who had stood up, was still on his feet. He had not sat down. He had been on his feet for almost 3 minutes now. 2 other counselors at the inner bench had quietly slid their oath rings off their own fingers and set them on the wood in front of them, not as a confession yet, only as a not wearing, the way a man removes his hat in a room where his hat has stopped meaning what it used to do. Old Brenner, the captain of the inner watch, was at the back of the hall. He had not moved during the chain. He had not moved during the ring. He had moved twice in the last minute. Both times he had moved toward the small door behind the council bench, the door that led to the moon chamber, and both times he had stopped halfway. He was deciding something. She could see it in the line of his shoulders. He had spent 15 years saying nothing in this hall, and he was deciding now whether to spend a 16th year the same way. The largest dead king completed its turn. Its empty eyes settled on her. "Luna," its voice arrived in the air. "The buried hand has read you. The buried hand finds the oath fire mark on your palm. The buried hand finds your bloodline in the line of the village at Charon. The buried hand finds you in agreement with no codex of the 7 kings." She held its gaze. She did not know if it could feel her gaze the way a living thing could. She held it anyway, because the holding was for the hall behind her, not for the dead. "I am," she said. The largest dead king did not move. Then, very slowly, the second one took a half step forward. The cinder crown. Its voice was lower, a thinner whisper, but still inside the heads of every soul in the hall, was placed upon you under lawful trial. The crown did not refuse you. The crown did not burn you. The crown chose you. The crown is a tool. The tool has moved without our hand. It paused. Tools that move without our hand, it said, are broken tools. Halvor opened his mouth. She lifted hers first. I am also, she said, a tool that moved without your hand. Take that up with the men who built me. The second dead king did not answer. The third one turned. Behind the third one, somewhere back in the half-ring, an eighth column of gray dust began to rise. She caught the eighth column out of the corner of her eye. It was not as tall as the others. It rose only to chest height. It did not take the shape of a king. It took the shape of a woman. The hall did not see her yet. The hall was watching the dead kings. The dead kings were watching her. The eighth shape thickened, slow, deliberate, off the left of the half-ring, and the lines of it resolved into a small narrow figure in a long plain robe. No crown, no bone in the skull. Only a thin braid of silver hair laid across one shoulder, and a left palm held out flat, with a faint, pale line across the heel of the hand. She did not need a name. The buried hand had not only kept the 7 kings. The buried hand had kept the first Luna who had ever been judged under their codex. The eighth shape did not turn to her. It did not turn to the kings. It did not turn to Halvor. It stood in the half-ring, palm out. As it had been buried, the way the southern records had said, the first Oathfire woman had stood when the council of second king had ordered her to be sealed under the floor. A noble on the upper benches made a small, wet sound. The hall saw, all at once, that the law the High Will Counselor had been quoting all morning had been written over a woman's body. Halvor saw, too. She watched his face do the small unconscious thing it had not done all morning. The small unconscious thing was a flinch. He had not flinched at the bottled voice. He had not flinched at the buried tablet. He flinched at the eighth shape. He had not, she suspected, known. That was the part that was almost worst. The codex had been built on top of a buried woman, and the man who had spent 40 years defending the codex had never been told. The first kings had not put her in the codex. They had put her under it. They had kept her at the foot of the law the way a man keeps a chain in a drawer he never opens. She turned, briefly, toward the eighth shape. I am sorry, she said. She did not say it loud. She said it for the shape, and for the band on her head, and for the small, private piece of her own chest that had needed to say it. The shape did not answer. The shape did, however, lift its head. The eyes were not gold like the eyes of the kings. The eyes were pale silver as the line on her palm. They settled on Serafine for the length of one held breath, and then they let her go. The shape did not bow. The shape was past bowing. The shape did not nod. The shape stood, palm out, and the standing was the answer. She turned back to the kings. You have the buried law, she said. You have the bottled voice. You have the chain on your king. You have the woman you buried under your floor. The hall has now seen all of it. You can finish this trial, or you can be the 7 witnesses of an Oathfire Luna who walked through your codex on her own feet. Those are the choices. They are the only choices left to you. The largest dead king turned its head toward Halvor, counselor. Its voice was almost gentle. Now the law you call us under is broken at the bottom. The hand that buried the first Luna was not our hand. The hand that bottled the king's voice was not our hand. The chain at the king's throat was not our hand. You have called us to defend the floor you broke. We will not. Halvor took a half-step back. She watched the half-step. She had not expected him to step back. She had expected him to argue. She had expected him to say, but the codex. The way a man says, but the bridge, when the river has already taken the boards. He did not say, but the codex. He said a different thing. I have served, his voice was tight, my whole working life, the law I was given. If the law is broken at the bottom, then I have served the break. I have not been told that. I will be told now. I will not be told gently. The largest dead king did not answer. The largest dead king did not have to. The hall behind, Halvor began to do the answering for it. The second counselor who had stood up was no longer the only counselor on his feet. A third was up. A fourth. A noble in the upper benches stood without looking at his neighbor. Old Brenner. At the back of the hall had stopped halfway to the moon chamber door. For the third time, and this time he had turned around, and walked back into the hall. And he was standing now at the foot of the back bench with his helmet under his arm. She watched the room rise, by small ones and twos. She did not yet know what the rising would mean. She would, in the next few minutes. She drew a slow breath. She kept her hand on the buried tablet. The other hand, the bleeding one, she held out, palm up, toward the throne. The throne was empty. Eric was beside her. The seat behind them was a chair nobody was sitting in. For the first time in 400 years, the hall noticed. The throne was empty. It had been empty for a few minutes already. Eric had walked down from it when she had asked him to. He had walked to the buried tablet, and then he had walked to the place beside her, and the chair he had been sitting on for the long week had been left without a body in it for the first time the hall could remember her. The hall noticed now because the hall had finally been given the room to notice. A king of Valorum had walked off his own throne in the middle of a trial, and his counselor had not stopped him, and his guards had not stopped him, and the 7 dead witnesses of the buried hand had not stopped him. The seat sat there at the back of the hall, polished black, drinking the lamplight, a piece of carved stone that had been built to hold the weight of a man, and was holding nothing. Eric saw the hall see it. He turned, slowly, toward the benches. There will be no return. His voice carried, of any condemned woman to the floor of this trial under the Codex of the 7 Kings. There will be no replay of the chain that was put around my throat. There will be no second use of the bottled oath that was pulled out of my voice. There will be no buried hand summoned by any councilor of mine, for as long as I have a voice the council does not own. The Codex is suspended. The buried tablet is open to public reading. The council will sit again in 7 days. He paused. He looked at the floor. I am not, he said, going to preside. The hall held its breath. I am, he said. One of the men this hall has to learn to live with. I am not a man this hall has to obey. I let my voice be folded and put in a drawer for the length of a week. I will spend the rest of my working life learning what that costs. I am not going to ask the woman I love to teach me the lesson by carrying it for me. He did not look at her when he said it. That was the part she would think about for a long time afterwards. He had not turned to her. He had said the sentence into the body of the hall, the way a man says, a hard sentence, into the part of the room where the people who need to hear it are sitting. He had not used her as the audience. He had used her as the truth he was speaking past, into a room that had spent the morning trying to decide what to do with both of them. She let him not look at her. She would not have wanted to be looked at in that sentence. She would have softened. The hall would have softened. The sentence needed the hardness it had. Behind her, a counselor at the inner bench stood up. She had been waiting for him to stand. He was the second counselor whose ring had melted at the start. He had held himself up against his bench for the better part of an hour. He stood now. He took the oath ring off his finger. The metal had cooled into a dull pale shape. He set it on the wood of the bench in front of him, the way a man sets his cup down when he is going to leave a tavern. I voted, his voice cracked at the second word, to confirm the rejection. I voted because the High Counselor put the Codex on the table in front of me, and I did not read it. I trusted the table. The table was a lie. I will not vote that way again in this hall. He sat back down. Lady Mirabel Frostwood stood from the council bench 2 rows behind him. She was past 60. Silver hair coiled at the base of her neck in the way the older women of the southern court wore theirs. Her left hip had been bad for 15 years. She came down from the council bench slowly, one hand on the wooden rail, and she walked the inlaid silver line of the floor from the bench to the spot beside Serafine where the buried tablet floated. She stopped 2 paces short. She did not kneel to Serafine. She lowered herself, with her hand on her own thigh, to one knee in front of the tablet. Her ring was already in her hand. She had taken it off on the bench. She had not waited. I was walking past the moon chamber. Her voice was thin but steady. On the second night the chain was being tied, I heard the king. I will not repeat what he said. I knew, the way a woman knows when she has spent 40 years in rooms with men, that what was happening behind that door was not the codex. I went to my chamber. I closed my own door. I made a cup of tea. I told myself the moon chamber was for the council, and the council had it under control. I was lying to myself. I lied to myself again the morning of the trial. I lied to myself this morning when I walked into this hall and saw the king bleeding on his throne and did not stand up. I am standing up now. It is far too late. I am standing up anyway. She set her ring on the marble in front of her knee. I am not, she said, asking the accused to forgive me. I am not asking the king to forgive me. I am offering the only thing I have. A week of my silence is a week of weight on this woman's head. I want to take some of it off. The band on Seraphine's brow shifted. It did not loosen. It changed. The pressure at her temples eased by a small measurable amount, and the silver flame above her hair burned a slightly warmer shade. A confession freely given, taken under the band, did not erase the lie. The band was not in the forgiveness business. The band only distributed weight. Mirabelle had volunteered to carry her share, and the band had let her. A young noble in the third bench stood. He did not walk forward. He stayed where he was. He pulled the oath ring off his hand, held it up so the hall could see it, then set it on the bench in front of him. I sat through the rejection. His voice cracked, and I voted to confirm. My mother is in the second bench. She is welcome to be afraid of me now. He sat back down. A priest at the altar stood. I blessed the rejection scroll, he said, without reading it. I will spend the rest of my service reading every line I am asked to bless. Then I will read it again. He stepped down from the altar, a scribe, a keeper of the moon altar, a captain of the Eastern Guard, a noblewoman who had not spoken in council in 9 years, and had served under Eric's grandmother. Then, at the back of the hall, near the open doors, Marcus stepped forward. He came down the aisle one slow step at a time. His boots made the small wet sound boots make on stone, when a man has not been sure he is going to take the step until the step is already under him. He stopped at the inner ring of the floor. He did not look at her. I escorted the accused this morning. His voice did not climb, and I did it because I was told to. I knew her. I knew her at the harvest feast 2 years ago. I knew her at the welcome ceremony. I had bread from her hand the winter my mother was sick. I walked her down a corridor at dawn this morning, and I did not lift my eyes once. I am lifting them now. He lifted them. He looked at her. I am sorry, his voice cracked, that I did not look at you in the corridor. He turned and stood at the wall. Thomas walked down behind him. He did not speak. He set his blade flat on the marble of the floor at her feet. He stepped back to the wall beside Marcus. And he did not lift his eyes again. But his hands at his sides were no longer shaking. The band on her head was almost weightless. She had not understood, an hour earlier, that the band could be made to weigh almost nothing. She had thought the weight was the price. The weight was the unpaid share. The hall had been paying. The hall had been paying for the better part of 15 minutes, in small confessions, and surrendered rings and lowered heads, and the band on her head had become a quieter thing than the band that had been lowered onto her by the high counselor. She did not let her face show it. She had not earned, yet, the right to be lightened. She turned instead to Halvor. He had been watching the cascade. He had not interrupted. He could not. The codex he had spent his life defending did not have a provision for what to do when a council confessed faster than it could be silenced. He had not built the switch. Neither had the first 3 kings. The men who had written the buried hand had assumed a council would always keep its silence, because a council had always kept its silence, and the assumption was now broken on the floor of the hall like a dropped cup. He had one move left. She felt him gather it before he made it. He lifted both hands. The ash on the 7 dead kings began to come off them. It came off slowly. The dead did not give willingly. The kings had been called by Halvor, and Halvor was, by the buried codex, allowed to draw on their weight in moments of crisis. He had not used the provision in 40 years. The provision had aged in him the way an old bottle ages in a cellar. He uncorked it now. The gray dust lifted from the shoulders of the seven figures and flowed across the half-ring toward him. It gathered at his sleeves. It thickened along his forearms. It rose up behind him into the air of the hall in a slow gray cloud, the shape of a wave that had not yet decided to break. The hall saw the wave gather. The hall did not know what the wave was. The hall knew that a wave like that, gathered in the air of a stone room above the heads of 200 people, was not gathered to be friendly. Halvor turned to her. "You have not won." His voice was quieter than she had expected it to be. "You have moved the hall. You have not moved the buried hand. The buried hand wrote the floor of the kingdom. If the hall will not enforce the codex, the dead will. If the dead will not, I will. 40 years of my work is not going to end with a woman in a torn gown writing on a tablet that men braver than I am buried 400 years ago." He brought his hands together. The wave broke. It came down off the ceiling toward her in a long gray slide of gathered ash. The smell of it filled the hall. The smell was older than the brazier ash, older than the bone in the band. The smell was the smell of the buried vault, of the bodies of the seven kings, of the silence of the woman they had buried under the floor. She had perhaps a half-breath to act. She turned. She did not think. She put her bleeding right hand on Eric's left. The chain at his throat had been waiting for the touch. She felt it gather. She felt it ready to bite. The band on her head moved a half-step ahead of the chain. The silver fire on her palm jumped from her skin to his, and the chain hit the silver, and the silver did not break the chain. The silver held the chain. The silver did not free him. The silver bought him a second. Into that second, his wolf came out from behind his eyes. Not all the way. Not free yet. Just enough to lift its head. The shadow of it stretched along the marble behind him, big as a draft horse, scarred down one side with the dark line where the chain had ridden it for the long week. Old beast. Patient beast. The kind of wolf that did not howl when it was hurt. The kind of wolf that remembered. His wolf and her silver fire met in the air between them. They did not merge, they stood next to each other. Two separate fires. Holding the same line, the wave hit. She did not feel it pass. She felt the pressure of it against the line they were holding, and she felt the line bend. And then she felt the line decide not to break. Behind her, every confession in the hall added a small, steady weight to the line. Mirabel's ring. The young nobles, the priest's blessing, the captain's word, the clerks, the scribes. Marcus's lowered eyes lifted. Tomas's blade set flat. Old Brenner's helmet under his arm at the back of the hall. Each abandoned oath, each volunteered confession was a small clean stone laid against the wave. The wave broke first. Not all at once. The dead kings did not lose. The dead kings did not have anything to lose, which meant the dead kings could only stop. The ash dropped out of the air. The wall of gray weather collapsed into a soft fall of fine-soot dust that settled the benches, on the altar, on the shoulders of every man and woman in the hall. And the dead kings stood in their half-ring around the cracked floor and did nothing. Halvor was on one knee. He had not been put there. The collapse of his own wave had taken his footing. He was kneeling on the marble. His robe was gray, with the ash of the very law he had called. His ring was still cracked. The script of Eric's rejection had stopped playing inside it. The ring was simply a ring now. An old silver band with an old silver stone. A piece of jewelry that had run out of its bottled voice. He looked up at her. She had expected to see hatred. She had expected to see fear. What she saw instead was tired. 40 years of carrying a codex he had not entirely believed in. 40 years of telling himself that what the first three kings had written was the only thing standing between Vealorum and another fall. 40 years of folding kings into chairs and lunas into ash. There was no triumph in the kneel. There had not been triumph in him for a long time. The codex had been his job, and the job had become him, and the man on his knees was the man the codex had used up. She did not feel sorry for him. That was the part she did not give herself permission for. The band on her head had taken enough of her trust by now that she did not have any spare softness lying around for a man who had bottled her king's voice and called the procedure. She would not be cruel. She did not need to be. The cruelty had already happened. She turned to the eighth shape. The first, Luna, was still standing in the half-ring of the dead kings, palm out, the way she had been buried. "I do not," Serafine said, "know your name." The shape did not answer. The buried hand had not given the shape a name. The southern records had not given the shape a name. 400 years had gone by, and the woman who had been laid under the floor of the kingdom to bear the weight of the codex had not been given a name, and the not naming was the last and oldest of the things that had to be put right. "I will," Serafine said. "Find your name I do not. Know where I will look. I will look. The hall above your floor will not be allowed to stop looking until your name is back where your name belongs." The eighth shape lifted its head. The pale silver eyes settled on Serafine for the length of 2 held breaths. Then the eighth shape lowered its hand. It was the first time in 400 years the palm had been allowed to fall. The shape did not vanish. The shape stayed in the half-ring with the 7 kings. But the hand was no longer out. The hand was at her side now, the way a hand is at a woman's side, when she is not being asked, by a council, to be a warning. The hall behind Serafine did not understand what it had said. She would not explain. Some of the work of the morning did not require an explanation. The marble at the very center of the hall, directly under the spot where she had been standing, when Halvor had lowered the band onto her hair, cracked again. It was a different crack from the seam beneath the throne. The first one had been a long line. This one was a circle. The marble dropped 3 inches, then stopped, suspended in the air above whatever lay below. Something rose from the well it had made. It was smaller than the band on her head. It was paler. It was carved out of a single piece of moonstone, white and quiet, with no jagged points and no fused bone. It had no jewels. It had no script. It looked, more than anything else, like a band of cool light worn into the shape of a circle. She knew what it was before anyone in the hall named it. Mirabelle, still on her knees behind her, made a small sound. "The other one," she said. "The one we were told was a story." "It is not," Halvor said quietly. "A story." The hall waited. The crown drifted up to chest height. It did not move toward Serafine. It did not move toward Eric. It hung in the well of the cracked floor, slow and patient, the way a thing hangs when it has been waiting to be asked. She understood, faster than she wanted to. What came next? The moonstone crown was the answer to the cinder crown. The first crown judged the lying. The second crown answered the truthful. She had survived the first. The second was open to her, and the hall would expect her to take it. The hall would expect her to lift it from the air and place it on her own head, and become, by acclamation, the Luna. The kingdom had spent the morning learning how to knead. She did not move. She felt the room expect it. She felt the dead kings expect it. She felt Eric, beside her, expect it, and she felt his expectation come with a small private grief, because he was a man who had loved her for 2.5 years, and would have liked, very much, to see her crowned by something that was not a punishment. She still did not move. "Eric," she said, quietly. He looked at her. "You stood up," she said. "Your wolf stood up. Your council started to stand up. The dead are out of weather. The crown is offered. I want you to listen carefully, because the next thing I say I will only say once." He nodded. "This morning," she said, "that man over there put a crown on my head because he was afraid of me. This afternoon, this hall is offering me a crown because it needs me. I want you to look at me and tell me you understand why I am going to refuse it." His mouth opened. He did not have the answer at the first try. He had the look of a man who had been raised to believe a crown was the way a problem became a person. She turned to face the hall instead. "You handed me one band," she said, "because you were afraid of what I would hear. You are now handing me a second crown because you need me to keep hearing it. Both crowns think I am a tool. I am not going to pick up either one." She let the line stand. She watched the meaning of it travel. The band on her brow was very still. The dead moonstone at the center of the silver dimmed. The black metal cooled against her hair. The pressure at her temples lifted by the last of what had been left to lift. She felt the weight come off her head and she let it. She raised her hands. She took the band off. She set it down on the cracked tile in front of her. The hall did not gasp. The hall had spent its gasps. The hall watched her set the band down the way a hall watches a smith set down a tool when the work is done. She did not take a step toward the moonstone crown. "You are not going to be a kingdom," she said. "That crown's a woman every time you need someone to do the hard thinking for you. You are going to be a kingdom that does its own hard thinking. I will help. I will not lead. I will not sit. I will not sign. I will tell you what I hear. I will tell you when I hear a lie. The rest of the work is yours." A councilor in the upper benches opened his mouth. She let his protest die in his throat. She did not have to silence him. The room did it for her. She turned to Eric. "This is the part that is yours," she said. He understood she did not have to explain. He drew a long breath. He walked to the buried tablet. He laid his right hand flat upon the crossed runes for a second time. The runes brightened a fourth shade, the warmest shade, and he began to speak the part the kingdom would need to hear. There will be, his voice held, no rejection of any woman of this kingdom made under chain, ash, codex, or correction. There will be no oath stored in a ring. There will be no Luna burned for being heard. The codex of the 7 kings is suspended. The buried hand is open to public reading. The first Luna under the floor will be given a name. The council will sit again in 7 days. I will not preside. Every confession given in this hall in the last hour will be entered into the record by Mirabelle Frostwood, who will be confirmed as the recording councilor of the new sitting. If she will accept the chair. Mirabelle, behind them, made a small sound that was almost laughter. She did not say no. Eric drew another breath. There will, he said, be one more law. He looked at her. She knew what it was before he said it. The band had been lifted from her head, but the gift had not. The silver on her palm had gone dark, but it had not left. She would see lies for the rest of her life. She would always know who was breaking what. That was the price of the gift, and she had decided. Somewhere between Mirabelle's confession and the moment the moonstone crown had drifted up out of the floor, that she would carry it. No crown, Eric said, may force a Luna's answer. No king may claim a bond rewritten by pain. No council may correct the voice of a wolf or a woman. Truth must be witnessed. Love must be chosen. So it is written. So it is heard. The hall did not cheer. The hall had not earned the right to cheer. The hall did the only thing the hall could do. The hall listened. The moonstone crown hung in the air for one breath more. Then it lowered itself back into the well in the floor. The marble closed over it. The 7 dead kings began, slowly, to settle back into the ash they had risen from. The 8th shape, the first Luna, did not settle. The shape walked, instead, 2 paces forward, lowered her head to Serafine without bowing, and then turned and walked into the wall of the hall, through the stone, the way a buried thing back to its rest when the rest has finally been earned. The hall let her go. Halvor was led out by 2 guards who had not been ordered to do anything. They knew, in the way that guards know things, that the man on the marble was no longer in command of the room. Eric turned to Serafine. He did not reach for her hand. He did not ask anything. He went down on one knee on the cracked marble the way Mirabelle had gone down. Not graceful, not kingly, slow, honest. I am not, he said, going to ask you to forgive me. I am going to ask you for the right to earn back the privilege of standing near you. If I never earn it, that is what I deserve. If I do, that is between us and no codex. She did not answer. She let the silence have its weight. Then she nodded once. Yes, not no. Understood, he understood. He stood up. She walked, slowly, toward the doors of the judgment hall. Eric did not follow her. He waited for her to look back. She did not look back, not because she was angry. Because the doors were heavy and she wanted to push them with her own hand. She pushed them open. The light outside was the gold light of a Velorum afternoon. Not gray anymore. The day had moved on while she had been busy not dying. She stepped out onto the stone landing above the courtyard. The courtyard below was crowded. Word had carried, the way word always carries from a hall like that one, through the lower halls and the kitchens, and out into the wider yard. There were nobles in the crowd. There were servants. There were guards. There were children on their fathers' shoulders. There were wolves in their shifted form, dozens of them. Sitting along the edges of the yard, the way wolves sit, when a thing they have been waiting for is about to be said. She did not have a speech ready. She did not need one. She lifted her bleeding palm. The silver line along the heel of her hand was quiet now. The light along it was the soft, cool color of a stone seen through clear water. She held the palm out, not as a sign, just as a hand. No woman of this kingdom, she said, will ever again be burned false, because the men around her are afraid of what her truth will reveal. The yard did not cheer. The yard had not earned the right to cheer either. The yard did what the hall had done. The yard listened. The wolves at the edges of the yard lifted their heads. The lower halls behind the yard would hear, by nightfall, the line she had said and the line the king had said inside. And the kingdom would begin, slowly. The long, slow work of becoming a kingdom that did its own hard thinking. She walked down the steps. Across the yard, she walked out of the palace through the eastern gate and into the road that led down to the lower town, and the wolves of the yard parted for her, without being asked, and the gate guards lowered their pikes and stepped aside, and the road was wide, and the afternoon was long, and she did not yet know where she was going. She would, by evening, know. That, friend, is where the story of the morning ends. The hall behind her was beginning the work of being something else. The crown was on the floor. The buried tablet was open to be read aloud. The man on the thrones was not on the throne. The codex was suspended. The first Luna under the floor would, by the end of the year, have a name, and the name would be written above the door of the new chamber. The council would build to hear the small testimonies of the women the codex had killed. Eric did not follow her down the road. He earned, instead, in the long, quiet months that followed, the small, slow things a man earns when he has decided he is going to spend the rest of his working life proving that the chain at his throat was not the truest thing about him. He did not push. He did not press. He did not appear at her door in the lower town with a ring in his hand and a speech in his mouth, the way the songs of the southern courts have a king appear when the songs want the women in the audience to cry. He did the smaller thing. He read the buried tablet aloud at the council sitting. He sat in the back row. He did the work. The bond between them stayed open. It did not close. It did not tear. The vow that had hung in the air of the judgment hall between her hand and his stayed where it had been. Not sealed. Not broken. Waiting. A door left ajar by a woman who had decided she would not be hurried back through it by the same kingdom that had locked her out of it once before. That is allowed. That is, in fact, the lesson. You can love a man and not move back in on his timeline. You can forgive a person and not absolve a system. You can walk out of the room you almost died in and not turn around to wave goodbye. None of that makes you cold. All of it makes you grown. Now I want to talk to you, friend, for a few minutes about the thing that almost nobody in that hall this morning understood, and that the kingdom of Vale Lorum, in the long, slow years after that morning, would have to learn the hard way. There is a difference between forgiveness and justice. Most people think they are the same thing. Most people are wrong. Forgiveness is what a man does with his own wound. He looks at it. He stops scratching at it. He decides on his own time that he is not going to let the man who gave it to him also get to live rent-free in his head for the next 30 years. That is forgiveness. It is a private thing. It happens between a man and his own quiet. Justice is different. Justice is what a kingdom does with the wound. Justice is the writing down of what happened, so the next woman who walks into a hall like that one does not get burned for the same reason. Justice is the council sitting back down and reading the buried tablet aloud, line by line, until the law of the buried hand is not buried anymore. Justice is the first Luna under the floor getting her name back. Justice is not about whether anyone gets to feel better. Justice is about whether the room learns. The hard part, friend, is this. You are allowed to do both. You are allowed to do only one. You are not allowed to confuse them. Serafine forgive Eric. The folks who have lived through enough of this kind of thing will tell you she had to. She had seen the chain. She had heard his voice come out wrong. She knew, in a way no codex could have explained, that the man under the winter pines and the man bleeding on the throne were the same man, and what had stood between them had been put there by hands that were not his. But she did not forgive the council. She did not forgive the codex. She did not forgive the buried law, or the men who had spent 400 years polishing the floor over it. That was the line. Forgiveness for the man, justice for the system. There is a thing you only figure out after enough years. Forgiveness can be mercy. It can also be the thing you do when you are too tired to hold the line anymore. Telling those two apart, friend, that might be the whole job of growing older. A man who forgives the wrong thing at the wrong time does not become a kind man. He becomes a quiet door. People walk through quiet doors. People walk over them. Eric understood that, in the end. That was why he did not ask her for forgiveness when he knelt on the cracked marble. He asked her for the right to earn the privilege of standing near her. Notice the difference. He did not ask her to forget the chain. He did not ask her to forgive the council on his behalf. He asked for the only thing a man in his position is allowed to ask for, which is the chance to live the rest of his life in a way that proves. The chain was the lie, and the love was the truth. That is the work of a long marriage, friend, and they were not married yet. They might never be. The vow between them was still hanging in the air between her door in the lower town and his quiet seat in the back row of the new council. Not closed, not torn, open, waiting. The kind of door that does not get pushed back through on anyone's schedule, but the woman holding the latch. If you have lived long enough, you know this choice. You have stood, more than once, with one hand on a door and the other hand on a hurt, and you have had to decide whether forgiveness was a mercy or a surrender. Sometimes you got it right. Sometimes you did not. I have done both. I expect you have too. So let me ask you, honestly, before I let you go, was there ever a time you forgave somebody too soon, before you were ready, just to keep a room quiet and it cost you something that did not come back? Or was there a time you held the line too long in the name of justice and you lost something that justice was never going to give back to you anyway? Tell me in the comments. I read them. I read the long ones too. There is no wrong answer to a question like that. There is only what you carried out of the room and what you set down at the door. The hall behind Serafine, on that gold afternoon in Velorum, was beginning the work of being something else. The hall ahead of you, in your own life, is doing the same thing. The crown is on the floor, the door is open, the buried tablet is being read out loud. Walk slow. Do not let anybody hurry you back through the wrong door, because they need you to do the hard thinking for them. Do your own hard thinking. Let them do theirs. And if you ever hear a voice you love come out of a mouth you love, friend, and you know, all the way down, that the words are not theirs, you do what Serafine Ashvale did. You stand in the room. You wait for the chain to show itself. You do not burn the man because the chain made him say a thing. You burn the chain. That is the whole story. Walk well.